James Thurber was born in Columbus, Ohio, and wrote that the chimes that rang in his dreams were from the clocks of Columbus. He's identified with the city that birthed the New Yorker, but he lived the last 25 years of his life in rural Connecticut, a place to whom he seems largely connected by sarcasm. It was never stronger than when Thurber, writing in the first person and not of his youth but of his middle age, cut to ribbons the archetypical country character of the fictional Ludlow, Connecticut, a man named Zeph Leggen. This was first published in Thurber Country in 1949, and my battered copy dates back to about 1980. Everybody loves Zeph Leggen, except a lady named Miss Eldon, who once turned to Zeph to get rid of some beetles she said were the size of mice, only to have him tell her that the only way to get rid of beetles the size of mice is to stop drinking. Everybody loves Zeph Leggen, except Miss Eldon and the town's newest resident, James Thurber, in part 2 of A Friend of the Earth by James Thurber. The grinning face of Zeph Leggen hung over my house in Ludlow like a moon. He didn't come around during the first couple of weeks, and I didn't send for him, although a number of chores needed doing. But his face was always rising in my consciousness, bland and bright and impudent, and I kept hearing the mischievous music of his harmonica, Old Maria, playing on the edges of my mind. The fellow had called me Bub, and I don't get over such things easily. Somewhere I felt he was thinking up gags or planning pranks to disconcert me. Paul Morton thought I was acting like a child about the town comic, especially when he found out that I couldn't use the studio behind the house until several rotted boards in the floor were replaced. Why don't you get Zeph over to fix it? Paul wanted to know. It was a foolish question, and I gave him a foolish answer. He insulted the memory of my dead wife, I said. Paul was amazed. You started that, he said. You spoiled his little joke about the dry goods store and got me in bad. He knew I had told you about it. I'm sorry, I said, but even if it hadn't happened, Leggen and I could never get along. Each of us wishes the other were dead. It takes all kinds of people to make up a world, Paul. The seasick sailor, the surgeon who faints at the sight of blood, and the man who hated Leggen. And I am destined to be known that after I'm gone. If Zeph were the last... Nuts, said Paul, and went away. It was about 10 days later that I heard the sounds of someone moving in the studio. I went out to investigate. It was Zeph. He was standing with his back to me, studying the rotted floorboards, and although he must have heard me come in, he didn't turn around. Fella goes into this grocery store, he said over his shoulder, and says to the man, "What you got in the shape of bananas?" "Cucumbers," says the man. He tapped one of the boards with his shoe and turned around slowly. "What you got in the shape of tools?" he asked. I wasn't going to play any games with the old rascal. I rented this house furnished, I told him. I haven't had time to find out where everything is. I thought you had tools of your own. He gave me the twinkle. "Won't know about that till I get back home," he said. He took it for granted that the job of fixing the floor, like all other tasks of the kind, was his by inalienable right, and I decided to let it go at that. "There ought to be a toolbox somewhere in the house," I said. He gave me the grin. "'Twon't come to us," he said. "Well, I have to go to it." On the way out of the studio, Zeph stopped at a table and picked up a flashlight that lay on it. He clicked it several times and then said, "Needs new batteries. I'll be going by Barton's store in Danbury this afternoon. Want me to take it along?" I told him that'd be fine and thanked him, and he put the flashlight in his pocket. I can't remember now where we found the saw, but the search lasted a good 20 minutes. Zeph examined it carefully and then put it down. "Can't use it," he said. "Left-handed saw." I studied it for a few moments. "I guess you have to bring your own then," I said. He frowned. "Job of work comes a little higher if I furnish my own tools," he announced. I turned without saying anything and led the way out of the house. "When can you get at the job?" I asked him. He looked at the sky and then held out one hand as if testing the quality of the air. "Bit dry for sawing," he said finally, but he couldn't trap me into any comment on this. "There's some sound planks in one corner of the studio," I said. "Did you see them?" Zeph's grin crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I saw 'em," he said. We both turned away at the same moment and went about our business. Or to be more exact, I went about mine. It rained that night, and there were showers off and on for several days. On the 4th day after Zeph's visit, I ran into him at the post office. "Why haven't you been over to fix the floor?" I demanded. Zeph unwrapped a stick of gum with great care, put it in his mouth, and chewed for half a minute. 'Twant sawin' weather, he said. Paul Morton would have laughed his head off, and I should have let it ride, but I didn't. 'Twar, I snarled loudly, and several of my neighbors turned and started. I decided I might just as well break with Leggin for good then and there. I don't think you can tell a hawk from a handsaw, I said sharply. I told you before that his mind was quick enough. He squinted at me for only a few seconds. You lay 'em out in the weather, he said. The one that rusts is the handsaw. Several people who had listened into this exchange laughed loudly. Old Zeph was in form. One of them slapped him on the back. I left the post office and walked home muttering to myself. Mail, said my wife when I walked into the living room. It was mail of a kind, 3 letters I had taken to the post office and forgotten to put into the slot. Part 2, the continuation, which we'll finish next week, of A Friend of the Earth by James Thurber. That's November 19th, 50 days since Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona decided to let Francisco Felix and Randy Shepard die. I'm Keith Olbermann. Good night. Good luck.